This is a CBC podcast.
I gotta say something. This is ridiculous. This is in my backyard again, and it's still going on. When are people going to learn that these trees are invaluable to us?
The campaign to stop logging of old-growth trees on Vancouver Island is drawing international attention and support from prominent Canadians, including music legend Bryan Adams, who can see the forest for the trees. Good morning, I'm Chris Holland. Today on The House, Bryan Adams joins me to discuss why saving the old-growth forest in the Fairy Creek watershed is so important. We also have a special report from the site of the protests and put these concerns to BC's Forestry Minister, Katrina Conroy. And
let's acknowledge where we fall short, but let's also channel the pain of a Canada falling short to build up the country and not tear it down.
Conservative leader Erin O'Toole is here to discuss the spring sitting of the Commons, his leadership, and why he wants Canada Day celebrations to go ahead despite another discovery of unmarked graves at a former residential school site. And up first, departing from the text, the Prime Minister resists demands for the resignation of a key cabinet minister over a message some Indigenous leaders call racist and demeaning. The House is now in session.
What Minister Bennett did was wrong, it was hurtful, and of course, I'm deeply disappointed. I know how hard she has worked and continues to work on this important file. I know her heart. I know the efforts she has put in over years on this, and we both understand that there is now even more work for her to do. And I know we will do it together.
Justin Trudeau stood by his Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations on Friday after Carolyn Bennett apologized for sending what she recognized was an insensitive and inappropriate comment to Indigenous MP Jody Wilson-Raybould. Bennett's text suggested Wilson-Raybould, a former cabinet colleague, was urging the Prime Minister not to hold an election out of concern for her own pension rather than the horror of discovering more unmarked graves at residential school sites. The Union of BC Indian Chiefs described it as a racist, demeaning message in an open letter that called for the resignation of Carolyn Bennett on a week where more than 700 unmarked graves have been located on the grounds of a Saskatchewan residential school. Grand Chief Stuart Phillip is the president of the union, and he joins me now from Penticton, BC. Welcome back to the House.
Good morning.
You heard the Prime Minister's remarks on Friday. He's not firing Carolyn Bennett as Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations or moving her to another post. What's your reaction?
Well, needless to say, I'm deeply, deeply disappointed with the wimpiness yet again on the part of the Prime Minister. Clearly, Minister Bennett has completely lost touch with her ministry and everything that it represents in terms of Indigenous people being the most important relationship to the Trudeau government. And her remarks the other day were absolutely outrageous in these times, these challenging times, these tragic times of finding hundreds upon hundreds of unmarked graves in former residential school sites. For Minister Bennett to stoop to such political pettiness indicates that she's not only totally incompetent, but she doesn't have the moral fiber and the ethical fiber to continue on in the important position that she holds.
You mentioned that the Prime Minister has repeatedly said the relationship with Indigenous people is the most important to his government. How do you square that, then, with this decision to stand by Minister Bennett? Does it suggest to you that maybe the relationship with her is more important than the one with Indigenous people?
Well, I think the Prime Minister himself, is equally incompetent, if not more so, in regard to how he's handled the Indigenous file in this country. If you look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that brought forward its report 6 years ago, complete with the 94 recommendations to action, the Trudeau government has completely fumbled the ball on implementing those recommendations. And Minister Bennett being his right-hand person, is absolutely incompetent in marshalling the power of the Prime Minister's office to get this work done. Carolyn Bennett has simply shepherded along the status quo, which is killing our people. And that's unacceptable. It's time for change. It's time that Minister Bennett go home.
Do you speak for, I know you speak for the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs, but are you saying what others are feeling? Or do you expect others to take the kind of stand that you're taking?
Well, for anyone that's met with Minister Bennett will fully understand the essence of the word incompetence. You know, this minister just doesn't have the principles and the courage and the integrity to aggressively bring forward the agenda for Indigenous people. Appalling housing conditions, still no potable drinking water. Children are still being apprehended. The government of Canada is still in the courts fighting parity for Indigenous children in care. It's a complete mess. And Carolyn Bennett is the one that was responsible for bringing these issues to the point of legislative reform, policy change, and has failed miserably at doing that. She has to go.
Right. Many of the things you talked about are now in the hands of Mark Miller as the Indigenous Services Minister. But let me ask you one final question. What is the way forward? With so much still left to be done, as you highlighted, if you have lost confidence in the minister who is in charge of the Crown Indigenous file?
Well, in my view, my own personal political view is there isn't anyone in Ottawa in a leadership position of a political party other than Jagmeet Singh that has the energy, the courage, and the moral integrity to take Canada in a direction that it is deserving of, and to return our prominence and stature to the international community. Let me say that Canada certainly does not deserve a seat on the Security Council in regard of the genocide that has been historically and in the contemporary world been perpetrated against Indigenous people, people of color, Indigenous women and youth, and Black people.
Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, I appreciate your time today. Thank you for this.
Thank you.
Grand Chief Stuart Phillip is the president of the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs. We also requested an interview with Minister Carolyn Bennett. We were told she wasn't available.
So my question is simple to the Prime Minister. Will he commit to Canadians that he and his cabinet will never break another law?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, while Conservative politicians are focused on baseless personal attacks, our steadfast focus has been on delivering for Canadians by getting progressive bills passed.
The House of Commons adjourned for the summer this week, and it's an open question whether they'll be back or on the campaign trail in September. The government pushed 4 bills through the House, including one to implement the budget in the waning days, and introduced another handful of bills that will not make it into law if an election is called. And as you just heard, the final day was less about debate and more about positioning. Conservative leader Erin O'Toole was one of the leaders pushing potential campaign themes, arguing the Conservatives are the only federal party that's different from the Liberals. To talk more about the session and a possible campaign, Erin O'Toole joins me now. Welcome back to the House.
Great to be back, Chris.
Oh, we're glad to have you. All right, the Prime Minister said this week that Parliament's become toxic and obstructionist. Sounds like he's setting the stage for an election. What do you think? Should Canadians expect to be going to the polls?
Well, I do think he's posturing for an election, that's for sure. But any delays in Parliament actually come from him. You know, many of these bills had to be reintroduced because he shut down Parliament, prorogued Parliament to stop the Weiss charity scandal investigation. He's filibustered literally every committee. They were 2 years late in a budget, Chris. So we've tried to work particularly on getting support programs to Canadians and improving them. But I do hold the Prime Minister to account for his ethical scandals. You know, he's had 3 reports from the Ethics Commissioner. There's a culture of entitlement and cover up that I think Canadians deserve better on. So that's what we've been holding to account to. He calls it personal attacks, but these are reports from the Ethics Commissioner. This is the public record, and I wish the Prime Minister would just follow the law.
So, but I'm trying to get a sense of as well is whether that approach is what you intend to run on, for example, if there is an election campaign.
Well, leadership is about trust, Chris. And if the Prime Minister countless occasions puts himself and his inner circle and Liberal insiders, now his lifelong friend, Mr. Pitfield, first, I think Canadians have to know that that's not leadership in the best interests of all Canadians. And so we'll be driving a contrast on some of the economic risks, inflation, massive debt, the housing crisis. Mr. Trudeau hasn't done many things to address any of that. And then, of course, the scandals going back to SNC-Lavalin, the We Charity, all of them, I think, shows of a tired and out-of-touch government.
You made a point this week to say the Conservatives are different from all the other parties in a speech you gave to caucus on Wednesday. So I want to look into that. So, for example, you talked about the economy. Would you, as a government, not have spent on emergency programs through the pandemic?
No, we would have. Yet we would have made them smarter and more effective, Chris. We were constantly trying to improve programs while we got the money out of the door quickly. We did improve the wage subsidy from 10% to 75%, you remember, to save jobs. But the government didn't adapt to the highly affected sectors, travel, tourism, hospitality. The program should have changed to address who's hurt the most. Mr. Trudeau paid taxpayer money to companies and airlines and others that did dividends and executive bonuses. That was a waste of taxpayer money.
So you wouldn't have done that. You wouldn't have allowed that.
No, absolutely not. It had to go to the highly affected. And if you look at tourism,
and by that you mean
example,
tourism. Yeah, okay. Hospitality.
Tourism, they will also be the slowest to recover because of restrictions. So we could have targeted the aid better. And unfortunately, the NDP and the Bloc, other parties kind of propped Mr. Trudeau up when he needed it, when he needed cover on the scandals. And that's why I lumped them all together.
All right. A lot of political observers believe you have moved the Conservatives to the political center on issues, for example, such as climate change and abortion. Are you a centrist?
The Conservatives are the only party in the center right, Chris. The other parties are out-competing each other on spending. They all support turning the CERB permanent into some sort of universal basic income. They all support making radical moves in terms of the environment without a plan to balance the job. So I have a very effective climate change program, but one that is meant to preserve jobs and focus on economic growth. So we're trying to reach areas where I think we did fall short in the past, but to do it in a way that gets people back to work in all parts of the country.
But is it working? Because if you look at the sort of amalgam of the recent opinion polls, you still trail the Liberals. You're roughly where you were in the best polls, where the party was in the last election campaign.
Well, I'm roughly where I am here on Zoom doing remote interviews and haven't been able to get out. So Chris, you're right. We're basically where we started, like the country is, waiting for a reopening. And there's only one party with a plan. We have a 5-point recovery plan I launched in March that will get people working. And as we get back out on the road, as we open up kind of around Canada Day, a lot of the provinces are going to be reducing restrictions. People will hear the message. And I think there's a fatigue with a government that's constantly in ethical scandals, that constantly divides one part of the country against another. And as I said, it's hard to determine the difference between Mr. Trudeau, Mr. Singh, Mr. Blanchet most days. And I think Canadians are tired of that sort of angry group of voices on the left.
The party, your party, would face challenges potentially in Alberta from the Maverick Party, the Western Separatist Party. Premier Jason Kenney, who endorsed your leadership bid, when an important part of that is under pressure for his government's response to the pandemic. Doug Ford has run into troubles. I'm wondering if, as you look ahead, are they helping you as a federal leader or hurting you as Conservative premiers?
I want to work with literally anyone that is worried about the economic crisis and the national unity crisis.
Right, but that wasn't my question.
Now.
I'm wondering if they're hurting you as you try to make the pitch to Canadians as the federal Conservative
leader.
I
don't think so, Chris. I think most Canadians understand the difference between the federal parties and the provincial parties. Most people know that the federal government was late on vaccines, the border and other things, and the provinces had to deal with making decisions on restrictions. It was a challenging set of circumstances for all premiers. premiers because Ottawa approves vaccines, does the contracts, closes the border. And if they made mistakes on those, which they did, the provinces pay the price. But I think as people, particularly other provincial premiers that I don't know as well, know my background of getting things done in the private sector and the military as a minister, I think we need a serious crew that will secure the future and heal the unity rifts. And so I'm getting out to Alberta. I'm looking forward to that. And I hope more Canadians get to see that there's an opportunity to move the country forward in a positive way. And I just want them to take a look at the Conservative Party.
I want to turn to another issue, and it's another very sobering announcement this week of preliminary evidence of unmarked, unrecorded grave sites at another former residential school, this one in Saskatchewan. What's your commitment to reconciliation as Canadians come to grips with these findings?
These are tragic reminders of how harmful the residential school program was, and the Cowessess First Nation now in Saskatchewan is bringing forward the unmarked graves and more tragedy. My first question as opposition leader in the House 9 months ago, Chris, was on reconciliation. I'm deeply committed to it. And for me, reconciliation has to be built upon trust. So when you make commitments on water quality on reserve, for example, I have no doubt that Mr. Trudeau is sincere when he does that, but he has no plan to ever get things done. And that's something we will move the ball forward because I think it's our duty as Canadians.
Okay, let me just say, there have been fewer boil water advisories since he took office, but I really want to stick with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission if I could. You've called it a dark chapter, and you have committed, I believe, to implementing those recommendations or calls to action 72 through 76 about unmarked gravesites, working with communities to commemorate identifying the people who may have been buried there. How is that different then from what the Liberals have been saying?
Well, 71 to 76 are the calls to action that I asked the Prime Minister and pledged our bipartisan support, Chris. Let's have a plan to not just achieve that and fund it and announce that by Canada Day. The country has been reminded of that tragedy and that dark chapter of our past. Let's recommit by Canada Day to a path to reconciliation that gives them certainty. The calls to action, Mr. Trudeau in 2015 said, I agree with all of them. And he's really only accomplished a handful of them, Chris. So this is not about announcing things and having good intentions. Leadership's about delivering. I've already had incredible discussions with Indigenous leaders, Indigenous organizations, from friendship centers to economic development organizations. They're going to find I want a partner. I want Indigenous Canadians involved in the governance to hold my government to account on achieving things. As I said, Mr. Trudeau, I know is sincere, but it's not just the announcement and the photo, Chris. It's about delivering, and that's what I will do as Prime Minister.
You mentioned Canada Day. You spoke about this this week, just before these discoveries. You said that the idea of canceling Canada Day was not the right thing to do, and you've protested in the past against the removing the name of Sir Johnny Macdonald, for example, from schools, taking down statues. And I wonder how that fits in with your view of reconciliation.
It fits in completely because reconciliation is reconciling our failures in the past, Chris, with our commitment to do better today. And I think what we have to do is channel the frustration and the sorrow of when we've fallen short in the past or even in the present, and channel that into doing better, not canceling Canada Day or just focusing on the bad of our country. That's why I asked Mr. Trudeau to commit to a plan on those calls to action for the missing children by Canada Day. Let's show today we're making Canada live up to the ideals that built the country, but we fell terribly short of in the past. It's about building up the country, not tearing it down.
I want to talk about the last week in the House of Commons, this past week. We know what you said about corruption, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the motion that was brought by your party to call a public servant, Ian Stewart, the head of the Public Health Agency of Canada, before the House to be admonished by the Speaker for not producing documents related to the firing of those two scientists at the Winnipeg Microbiology Lab. Now the government's taking the Commons to court. I guess the question most Canadians would like to ask is, how did it come to this?
Because we have the most secretive, cover-up prone government in Canadian history, Chris.
But they offered you a compromise to release the documents. It was a last-minute one, I understand that, but a compromise similar to the one in 2010 when the then Conservative government released documents on Afghan detainees to an ad hoc committee buttressed by national security experts. Why didn't you take that?
That was not offered until we were already in the contempt
But it was
process
offered.
and bringing Mr. Stewart to bear. They also threw a fine civil servant under the bus on the We Charity scandal, and everyone knows that did not come from the civil service. It came from the Trudeau.
Well, wait a minute. You were the one that brought him before the bar to be admonished. Your party pushed that motion forward, endorsed by the other opposition parties. So I guess what I'm asking you here is, why wouldn't you have moved non-confidence against the government if you believe as strongly as you do that they're covering up these documents and there's important information in there?
We brought a contempt proceeding because that is the power we have. We also did the same thing to Minister Sajjan for his cover-up of sexual misconduct allegations. We censured the minister. There's no teeth to it, but it's all Parliament can do to say we're tired of the culture of ignoring the House and cover-ups. And Chris, most days there's not even a single Liberal MP in the House of Commons. Now, to me, they've tried to neuter our democracy throughout this pandemic, and that should concern Canadians.
Well, again, you didn't move non-confidence. If you feel that strongly, you want to see those documents, then why not do that? We
looked at a variety of options. We truly believe that Mr. Stewart would, given the Afghan detainee document situation in the past, we said, let's make sure secrecy is preserved. They continually hide behind the civil service when it suits covering up their purposes. They did that with the We Charity scandal, Chris. They did this again now. Canadians want transparency. They want the transparent by default that Mr. Trudeau once promised years ago. It's been the exact opposite. This is the most opaque, secretive, and quite frankly, corrupt government I've ever seen.
Right. Last question for you. The partisanship and bickering that we have seen, I think that it's not that unusual at this time in the life of a minority government or when the summer's approaching. But the personal edge that you bring as a new leader of the opposition, it didn't work for Andrew Scheer in 2019. Why do you think it will work for you in 2021?
Well, there's no personal edge. In fact, when I hold someone to account
calling
for
the
their
Prime Minister
actions,
corrupt, so that seems pretty personal to me.
Well, there's been 3 investigations into his ethical conduct, Chris.
Right, I understand that. But
they have to number the reports in terms of the investigations on him. Mr. Morneau, it was 2. Dominic LeBlanc. So this is a leadership culture that's set at the top by the Prime Minister. And quite frankly, on the sexual misconduct cover-up in the military, I don't believe the Prime Minister when he said he didn't know. His clerk, his chief, the minister, all these people around him knew, yet they promoted the Chief of Defence Staff with an outstanding allegation against him.
But the question I asked you, though, is why do you think that will work if you have to go to the people sometime later this year?
Well, I think people vote for their local MP, they vote for a party, they also vote based on leadership. And I don't think Mr. Trudeau has demonstrated ethical leadership. It's something very important for me, Chris, as someone who came from the sort of middle class of the Toronto suburbs and served in the military. Like, I got into politics after accomplishing some things and standing up for what is right, being honest and putting the country first is what I've done my entire adult life. And I think there's a different culture with Mr. Trudeau. Not personal attacks against him. As I said, on reconciliation and other things, I know he's sincere. He just never delivers and constantly lets down.
All right. I have to leave it there. I appreciate your time this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Erin O'Toole is a leader of the Conservative Party of Canada. We spoke in greater detail with Erin O'Toole on some of these issues. To hear the full discussion, go to our website, cbc.ca/The House. I'm Chris Hall, and you're listening to The House on CBC Radio 1 and Sirius XM. You can also hear the show by using the CBC Listen app or follow us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
Truck drivers, it's time to step up and get rolling with T-Force Freight. Drive for a team that's respected everywhere. As a CDL driver in Elkridge, you'll earn $28 per hour plus 50 cents per mile with great benefits. Take pride in your work. Join the team at T-Force Freight in an essential job that keeps our country moving. Or join the team as a CDL dock worker with jobs up to $28 per hour. Apply now at upsjobs.com. That's upsjobs.com.
For 10 months, a group of activists have been disrupting logging activities in the southwest region of Vancouver Island. It's the largest sustained act of civil disobedience around old-growth logging since the so-called War in the Woods of the mid-1990s. And it's raising awareness around the impact of old-growth logging in British Columbia. Earlier this month, the BC government agreed to postpone logging in the Fairy Creek watershed for 2 years. But activists aren't satisfied, and the conflict seems set to continue. CBC's Kieran Oudshorn has been reporting from behind the lines of the Fairy Creek blockade since police started arresting protesters last month, and he takes us there with this report.
It's a long, slow hike up a steep logging road to get to Waterfall Camp, one of several blockades set up to stop road building and logging around the Fairy Creek watershed. The area is a rare example of an unlogged valley on southern Vancouver Island. Last month, protesters dug themselves in, literally. And police helicopters circle overhead, and the RCMP are preparing to use heavy machinery to cut the activists out of their blockades, but these activists are determined to hold the line. A man calling himself Rib Dog is laying face down in the mud, his arm disappearing underground.
I'm in a sleeping dragon.
And what is that?
It's basically a PVC pipe concreted into the ground with a steel plate over top of it. So if they want to get me out, they have to get through the steel plate and get through the concrete to cut the chain that I'm attached to. If they want to get us out of here, they've got to come with full force.
I'm Alice. I'm chained to this bus. I don't know how long I'll be here. We're doing this just as a symbolic gesture, I suppose, as well as a way to slow them down and make their jobs harder. It's absurd that we still have to be doing this fight in 2020, but we do.
But the battle here in late May was ultimately lost. A woman named Clover sings as the police extract protesters from their sleeping dragons with jackhammers. She's trying to calm her colleagues' nerves because the machinery is only inches from their heads. It took the RCMP 3 days to clear the camp and the surrounding areas and to arrest those who were obstructing the logging roads.
And if you can just spin around for me. Perfect, thank you. Do you have your ID for me?
Though once the police left, the activists quickly returned to reoccupy the site, while a smaller group of people retreated higher into the hills. The hike to Ridge Camp is through the old-growth forests, through towering cedars, hemlocks, and spruce. It's an unforgiving trail, steep, slippery, and dangerous, hugging the high ridges the entire way. A man known in camp as Karst is one of the senior members of the so-called Rainforest Flying Squad.
That's a yellow cedar above us. Down below us there's, what is that, like 7 or 8 feet across? Red cedar, high up on a ridge. And it's like a perfect specimen. It's such a healthy tree. Wow, I haven't seen one any bigger than that one there.
Here at Ridge Camp, activists have set up what they call tree sits. They're small 4 by 8 foot platforms that they live and sleep on. They have food, tarps, sleeping bags, and climbing equipment, everything they need to hold out for weeks. And they're occupied by people like Mo, who Karst sees calling down from her lofty perch.
How you feeling up there?
Good, yeah. It's a beautiful day to be up here.
Wow, it's so beautiful to see you up there. That's such a sacred place to be, hey?
Yeah, surrounded in tarp.
Living in the lichen.
One man has hoisted a small wooden boat into a hemlock tree. And the CBC microphone is hauled up by rope to where he's camped out.
Okay, take it up.
Okay, yeah, my name is, my code name around here is Lou. This is a mountain hemlock, and I'm probably about, I'd say 40 feet up in the air. There's also a line that goes further down to another hemlock, and that's a zip line. And yeah, basically I'm planning on going right in the middle of those 2 trees and hanging there, which has proven to be difficult for the special forces to get us out of there. So yeah, what I'm sitting in is a little sailing dinghy, basically, that has quite a long history from a friend. It's really comfortable, actually. There's lots of room for me to have tons of food, tons of gear, and yeah, enough gear to stay here for a while. When I look to my right, I can see the watershed, Fairy Creek watershed, and what we're protecting, what we were wanting to protect. One of the many places that we're hoping to keep intact. You know, we've positioned ourselves so we are right in line of the road building and of the falling, and yeah, there is no way they're coming around us. We're right in their way, and we'll stay here until until they go back down the hill.
It feels like you're at the edge of the world here sometimes.
Across the various protest camps, there are hundreds of activists that are rotating in and out, and on weekends those numbers grow to thousands. And at any given time, there's a half dozen or so people living and sleeping in the treetops.
It's pretty precarious. It moves a lot. At first, sure, it was a little bit, unnerving, but now I don't even have a harness on up there anymore. I don't sleep with a harness on. You just kind of get comfortable and you understand, and trust that this ancient 100-year-old tree is going to protect you.
Shauna Knight has been part of the blockades since day one.
The way that the government works and the politics of things, it takes time, and we keep talking and we have meetings, and all the while the saw is still going. So it's at a critical point. It's at such a low percentage of intact old growth, and we're here to help pause the saw.
Knight's grandmother attended residential school in British Columbia's interior, but she's lived most of her life estranged from that indigenous part of her identity. She says the Rainforest Flying Squad and their blockades were invited to this territory by a Pachidat elder who wants old-growth logging to stop. But several First Nation band councils, including the Pachidat, are among those who have signed logging agreements with the government.
It's only been 130, 40, 50 years that we've managed to almost completely, destroy ancient forests that have been here since First Nations people have been stewarding these lands since time immemorial. So, it should be First Nations who have control of natural resources, because they were doing just fine.
There are people who will argue that the chief and council here in Pachidat territory have signed off on this road being built that you're blocking, on logging that's happening in their territory that you're blocking.
So, as I understand and have come to see more clearly, elected chief and council are colonial constructs that don't necessarily represent the views of a community. I mean, when you destroy a culture and a community and you take away their language and their opportunities and they're struggling in poverty for survival, we can't expect these people to be standing up for things when they're in survival mode. So it's our responsibility to amplify the voices of those people that have concerns over how their territories are being managed.
The 2-year deferment on logging in the Fairy Creek watershed doesn't go far enough for this group. Many want to see an end to old-growth logging forever, while others just want to see a pause until new forestry practices can be developed. In the meantime, they're determined to make this their last stand. For The House, I'm Kieran Alshorn in the Fairy Creek watershed on Vancouver Island.
Just there's no, if you want to be the farthest out you can be right now.
Last week, more than 100 prominent Canadians, including former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, signed an open letter calling on BC's Premier John Horgan to protect the province's old-growth forests. One person who signed that letter is Canadian music legend Bryan Adams, who began his career in British Columbia. And he joins me now with his friend TJ Watt, a campaigner with the Ancient Forest Alliance. Welcome to the House, guys.
Hey, thank you.
Brian, let me start with you. You're involved with a number of efforts to protect rainforests around the world, planting trees, and now you're involved in an effort to stop logging of a rainforest in your home province. How does this cause compare to the other campaigns you've been...
Let's go back. I mean, I started campaigning against logging in British Columbia, old-growth logging, back when the Carmanah Valley was being destroyed. So, I mean, my history with this is not new. So when I saw, and I want to give credit to TJ, who's on the call with us here. TJ is an incredible photographer, and when I saw his photographs of what had gone down at Fairy Creek and around in the region there, of the before and after photographs of trees that had been just, I mean, must have been there for hundreds of years and just cut to the toes. I thought, I got to say something. This is ridiculous. This is in my backyard again, and it's still going on. When are people going to learn that these trees are invaluable to us? They don't come back, and we've got to protect them.
Yeah. I wonder how the Fairy Creek protest compared to the Clayoquot Sound protest back in the 1990s when there was clear-cutting happening there. There was a lot of arrests then. It was one of the largest acts of civil disobedience in Canadian history, and I'm wondering why this doesn't get the same kind of attention.
Well, it is truly getting a lot of attention out here in British Columbia. I'm not sure if it's making it across Canada, but I was just a young kid in the days of Clayoquot, so I wasn't there to witness it. But I think where this is really getting attention in this day and age is through social media.
Yeah, Brian, you played a role in that, right? You've put a petition up on social media calling on people to get involved. You've signed up a call for a lawyer to defend the protesters who've been arrested. It's a big deal for you.
Well, I mean, someone's got to say something, and you can't sit back. And I'm surprised that more people aren't outraged by this. I really am. In this particular case, I really think that British Columbians need to know what's going on. They need to know how much their government is letting them down, and they need to know that the people that are responsible for these kind of clear cuts have not considered properly the outcome of what they're doing.
Yeah, in fact, I think you wrote on one of your social media accounts that you hope British Columbians vote out the current government in the next election.
Yeah, I do. I mean, this is disgraceful. This isn't what we voted for. This isn't what people vote. People don't vote for tearing down ancient trees. If people knew more about what was going on, they would seriously be outraged.
TJ, there has been a deferral for 2 years. I know that's not satisfying many folks, but is the BC government at least trying to make some effort to reach an accommodation here?
Yeah, there was a 2-year deferral put in place for the Fairy Creek Valley and for the Central Walbrand Valley, which are two very important areas. But their own independent old growth review panel report states that all old growth forests need to be deferred where they're at risk, and especially those big old growth trees, which are so rare on the landscape today. It's about 97% of the big tree old growth forests have now been logged across British Columbia. We're talking about some of the last 2.7% of the most magnificent trees that remain. And people are not going to be happy when they see that old growth trees are still falling just outside those deferral areas, and the government's not taking this seriously.
But the province says it is trying to follow the recommendations of that review, and in particular, they've been consulting with Indigenous people, including the Band Council in the area. And I just wonder why that isn't at least good enough, because it does seem there's some support for logging amongst the Indigenous community.
Yeah, where the government really needs to step it up, and essentially where they're failing right now, is bringing funding to the table so that First Nations have a fair choice in whether and on the scope and scale of the deferrals that are made in their territories. Right now, they're essentially being forced to choose between logging of old growth forests or losing the jobs and revenues that come from logging old growth, because there's a lot of money to be made. But these are highly endangered ecosystems, and the federal government right now has put $2.3 billion on the table to expand protected areas across Canada over the next 5 years. And a few $100 million of that should be available for British Columbia and should be directed towards protection of old growth forests in BC, so that nations aren't forced to choose between liquidating the last old growth in their territories or protecting them.
Chris, I got a question for you.
Yeah.
Have you seen the cover of the last British Columbia magazine? You should have a look. You should have a look at TJ's before and after photographs.
I have seen those photos. Yeah, they're quite astonishing.
Yeah, and I mean, listen, I don't think anybody is going to say we have to stop logging. That's not the issue here. The issue isn't we want people to continue to have their jobs and everything, but when you come across a stand of trees that are literally the size of I can't even how wide are they, TJ?
Those trees, the biggest ones there are 12 or 13 feet in diameter.
When you come across a tree like that, it's just okay, guys. Let's just we'll cut up to 1 acre around this, and we'll keep that tree, and then carry on. But you just don't go plow through and cut everything down. It's just barbaric.
You mentioned, Brian, at the start that you've been involved in these kinds of movements for a long time. How is this one different then?
It's not. It's just the same old story over and over and over again. I mean, as TJ has mentioned, that this comes down to money, and this is a money issue. And there's been contracts signed, and I's and T's have been dotted, and all that's been happening. But there's been no real consideration for some of these big trees, and that's why I'm stepping up.
Last question, TJ, to you. What next?
Well, we need a government that actually has a real vision for how to implement this report that calls for a full paradigm shift in the approach to forest management in BC and the protection of old growth forests. No more tinkering around the edges. If they want to truly protect old growth and move forward with fair and just reconciliation, they need to put money on the table so that nations have a fair choice in determining the outcome of old growth forest protection in their territories, and to ensure that the survival of these endangered ecosystems and endangered species is made possible going into the future.
All right. I have to leave it there with you two. I really appreciate your time today.
All right. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. Brian Adams, Canadian musician, of course. TJ Watt, who is an organizer with the Ancient Forest Alliance. More than 260 people have now been arrested at the blockades on Vancouver Island. On Thursday, the province announced the creation of an independent old-growth technical advisory panel. Its mandate is to ensure forest and land management are science-led. Katrina Conroy is BC's Minister of Forests, Lands, Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development, and she joins me from her Kootenay West riding. Welcome to the House.
Well, good morning, Chris. Great to be here.
Well, thank you for taking the time. Let me start by asking you what you thought or your reaction was to the letter that was sent by more than 100 prominent Canadians, including former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney and Brian Adams, calling on the Premier to get him to stop logging the trees in the Fairy Creek watershed.
Well, I respect people's, right to voice their opinions and to reach out, but I also think that people also need to reach out to the Indigenous nations on whose traditional territory the old growth is, and have a conversation with them, because that's what we're doing. I think it shows respect to ensure that we are talking to the Indigenous nations, and it was also the number one recommendation in the old growth review that was done, and so we are following that recommendation and ensuring we're having those discussions.
Okay, I want to get to that in a second, but we mentioned working with Indigenous communities, but there are some Indigenous groups who want to preserve these trees and others who want to harvest them. So I wonder how do you balance those competing views?
So we have to make sure that we are working with Indigenous nations, and there's nations that have reached out to us, and our ministry is working with all the nations who have reached out. And you're right, they want to continue to harvest. They're very involved in the forest industry, and some want to conserve. So we need to work with them to ensure that we're meeting their needs, what their wants are, and ensuring that we have to take into consideration all the other aspects of the forest industry while we're doing that. But it's the primary issue that we have to take into consideration is the wants, needs of the Indigenous nations.
So how does it fit with this new advisory panel you've set up? What is it going to do, and will it make recommendations that would be binding on you?
No, so what the panel is going to do is it's going to share and analyze the data on old growth, including maps. And this is a panel of scientists, biologists, foresters who understand and have been working with old growth data for years. So we're going to have them working with our existing people that work in the ministry, and we're going to make sure that the data and the maps and the advice that they bring together, it'll support our government in identifying priority areas for future deferrals, but this will help us ensure that we are looking at the areas of biodiversity that are really critical right now.
We heard a piece from a reporter with some of the protesters, and what they say is they're not interested in technical panels or deferring for 2 years the logging in Fairy Creek. They want an end to logging. So what do you say to them?
Well, it's a bit more difficult than just saying we're going to end logging, because we're not. And even the old growth report said that there would still be some old growth logging in this province. They recognize that. When they did an analysis, they talked to hundreds of people across the province, so they did a very thorough analysis. And what we need to do is find that balance. And so in reaching out and having those, government-to-government conversations with Indigenous nations, we're trying to work with the nations to determine what they want. But we're also working with other people, and that's what's critically important. We're working with our other partners in the province, like working with companies, working with workers, also the forestry-dependent communities that are, across this province, and also environmentalists. We're talking to them about what their views are and bringing people together. And that's, I want to get away from the divisive, practices that we see and ensure that we're...
I want to pick up on this because there's an issue about why these trees, in particular. We've had Brian Adams on the show ahead of you, who thinks your government should be voted out of office because you're not living up to the commitment to try and protect old-growth forests.
Yeah, I've talked to Brian and had a really good conversation with him and understand his passion. I've also explained to him that, we need to look at the big picture, and we have said, we've been very clear, we're implementing all 14 recommendations of the Old Growth Report.
Right.
And the Old Growth Report, the number one recommendation is ensuring we're having those government-to-government discussions.
But
and
it also called,
two,
Minister, it also did call for a paradigm shift in approach to old growth forests,
exactly.
including that they're managed as an ecosystem and to make sure the health of that ecosystem is in place, and recognizing that in many cases, perhaps even with Fairy Creek, that these are not renewable resources.
Mm-hmm. And so to that, and you're right, and it's a good question. And to that end, we have already deferred, over 200,000 hectares of old growth, and that was done last fall. We went and we listened to the Indigenous nations, and we deferred Fairy Creek, the watershed at Fairy Creek, and we deferred Upper Walbrand area, which were two areas very close to each other. But that was after discussions with the three Indigenous nations who asked for that deferral.
Because there are some people who say this is basically a talk and log process here, as opposed to talking until a decision is reached. Again, what would you say to those people who are concerned that the saws are still being used?
Well, they're not being used right now in Fairy Creek because it's been deferred, and it's not. And we also brought in a regulation in September. One of the other things we did in September is we brought in a special tree regulation, which protects those really large trees that people think about when they're thinking of old growth, and those huge beautiful trees that when you can't hug them, they're so large. And so we've protected over 1,500 of those trees, and it's a grove of trees because you can't just protect an old growth tree by itself. You have to protect the biodiversity around it. So we brought in regulation to protect those trees. And we also have a difference of opinion, which is we're really hoping that the technical panel will help us with, on what actually constitutes an old growth tree. We believe that on the interior, we do have old growth in the interior. People don't seem to recognize that, but people across Canada should know. We have old growth in the interior, and that's a tree that's 140 years or older. On the coast, it's 250 years or older. And so we need to look at that data, look at those numbers, and make sure we're moving forward to protect that. And that was why when we deferred in 9 areas in September, there was areas on the coast, but there was also areas in the interior.
Okay, let me ask you one last question, and that is, if these protests continue, what concerns do you have? I remember Clayoquot Sound, I'm not sure you do, but that was an international incident. There was probably the largest civil disobedience display in this country. Is that what we're facing potentially here?
Well, I hope not. I mean, I do remember Clayoquot well. My husband, I lived it vicariously. My husband was in government in the 90s. So, okay. But I
didn't want to date you.
That's okay. You can date me. I'm fine being dated. I hope that people will respect the wishes of the Indigenous nations who have asked to be left in peace, to undertake their integrated resource management plans, to work. I mean, it's caused some issues within nations, and nations need to work amongst themselves to determine the direction they're going in. So I really hope that people will respect the nations and respect their voices, because reconciliation is tough. And I think Grand Chief Stuart Phillips says it's not for wimps, and it's not. But we can't only move forward with reconciliation when it serves our needs. We have to respect reconciliation is something we're doing in this province, and we're very serious about it. So we are moving forward, working with Indigenous nations. And the other thing I say, I'll date myself. I have 9 grandkids, 4 kids, and my goal as forestry minister is to ensure that, one of these days I'm going to be looking at myself in the mirror, and I have to ensure that not only do we have a sustainable, well-managed forest industry, that if my grandkids choose, if they want to work in the forest industry, I want to make sure they can do it in a well-managed, sustainable forest industry. But I also want, if they so choose, to have the opportunity to walk in an old-growth forest with their kids. And that's my goal, and we have to modernize the forest industry in BC. We have to move forward and make sure that we're modernizing it, and old growth management is a huge part of that, ensuring that we have old growth for years to come.
Okay. Appreciate your time this morning. Katrina Conroy is the Minister of Forest Lands, Natural Resources Operations, and Rural Development in British Columbia. Nice to talk to you.
Nice to talk to you too, Chris. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And that's it for us this week. Our crew on the house is Christian Paz Lang, Emma Godmere, and Spencer Van Dyke. Our senior producer is Jennifer Chevalier. Technical production by Conrad Ijazi and Vincent Desjardins. I'm Chris Hall. Thanks for listening. The House is back in session in 7 days.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.